Chapter 23 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Harn and A. B. Poland. Chapter 23 Henry II and His Sons. Henry II, 1154 till 1189, and his sons, 1189 till 1216. In 1154, while Barbarossa was reigning in Germany, Henry II, one of England's greatest monarchs, came to the throne. Henry was the son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou in France, and Matilda, daughter of King Henry I and granddaughter of William the Conqueror. Count Geoffrey used to wear in his hat a sprig of the broom plant, which is called a Latin Plantagenista. From this he adopted the name Plantagenet, and the kings who descended from him and ruled England for more than 300 years are called the Plantagenets. Henry II inherited a vast domain in France, and managing this, in addition to England, kept him very busy. One who knew him well said, "He never sits down, he is on his feet from morning till night." His chief assistant in the management of public affairs was Thomas Becket, whom he made Chancellor of the kingdom. Becket was fond of pomp and luxury, and lived in a more magnificent manner than even the king himself. The clergy had at this time become almost independent of the king. To bring them under his authority, Henry made Becket Archbishop of Canterbury, thus putting him at the head of the church in England. The king expected that Becket would carry out all his wishes. Becket, however, refused to do that, which the king most desired, and a quarrel arose between them. At last, to escape the king's anger, Becket fled to France and remained there for 6 years. At the end of this time Henry invited him to come back to England. Not long after, however, the old quarrel began again. One day, while Henry was sojourning in France, he cried out in a moment of passion, while surrounded by a group of knights, "Is there no one who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights who heard him understood from this angry speech that he desired the death of Becket, and they went to England to murder the archbishop. When they met Becket, they first demanded that he should do as the king wished, but he firmly refused. At dusk that same day they entered Canterbury Cathedral, again seeking for him. "Where is the traitor Thomas Becket?" one of them cried. Becket boldly answered, "Here am I, no traitor, but a priest of God." As he finished speaking, the knights rushed upon him and killed him. The people of England were horrified by this brutal murder. Becket was called a martyr, and his tomb became a place of pious pilgrimage. The Pope canonized him, and for years he was the most venerated of English saints. King Henry was in Normandy when the murder occurred. He declared that he had had nothing whatever to do with it, and he punished the murderers. But from this time Henry had many troubles. His own sons rebelled against him, his barons were unfriendly, and conspiracies were formed. Henry thought that God was punishing him for the murder of Becket, and so determined to do penance at the tomb of the saint. For some distance before he reached Canterbury Cathedral, where Becket was buried, he walked over the road with bare head and feet. After his arrival he fasted and prayed a day and a night. The next day he put scourges into the hands of the cathedral monks and said, "Scourge me as I kneel at the tomb of the saint." The monks did as he bade them, and he patiently bore the pain. Henry finally triumphed over his enemies and had some years of peace, which he devoted to the good of England. In the last year of his life, however, he had trouble again. The King of France and Henry's son Richard took up arms against him. Henry was defeated and was forced to grant what they wished. When he saw a list of the barons who had joined the French king, he found among them the name of his favorite son John, and his heart was broken. He died a few years later. Henry's eldest surviving son, Richard, was crowned at Westminster Abbey in 1190. He took the title of Richard I, but is better known as Coeur de Lion, the Lion-hearted, a name which was given him on account of his bravery. He had wonderful strength, and his brave deeds were talked about all over the land. With such a man for their king, the English people became devoted to chivalry, and on every field of battle brave men vied with one another in brave deeds. Knighthood was often the reward of valor. Then, as now, knighthood was usually conferred upon a man by his king or queen. A part of the ceremony consisted in the sovereign's touching the kneeling subject soldier with the flat of a sword and saying, "Arise, Sir Knight." This was called the accolade. Richard did not stay long in England after his coronation. In 1191 he went with Philip of France on a crusade. The French and English crusaders together numbered more than 100,000 men. They sailed to the Holy Land and joined an army of Christian soldiers encamped before the city of Acre. The besiegers had despaired of taking the city, but when reinforced they gained fresh courage. Coeur de Lion now performed deeds of valor which gave him fame throughout Europe. He was the terror of the Saracens. In every attack on Acre he led the Christians, and when the city was captured he planted his banner in triumph on its walls. So great was the terror inspired everywhere in the Holy Land by the name of Richard that Moslem mothers are said to have made their children quiet by threatening to send for the English king. Every night, when the crusaders encamped, the heralds blew their trumpets and cried 3 times, "Save the Holy Sepulchre!" and the crusaders knelt and said, "Amen." The great leader of the Saracens was Saladin. He was a model of heroism, and the two leaders, one the champion of the Christians, and the other the champion of the Mohammedans, vied with each other in knightly deeds. Just before one battle, Richard rode down the Saracen line and boldly called for any one to step forth and fight him alone. No one responded to the challenge, for the most valiant of the Saracens did not dare to meet the lion-hearted king. After the capture of Acre, Richard took Ascalon. Then he made a truce with Saladin, by which the Christians acquired the right for 3 years to visit the Holy City without paying for the privilege. Richard now set out on his voyage home. He was wrecked, however, on the Adriatic Sea near Trieste. To get to England he was obliged to go through the lands of Leopold, Duke of Austria, one of his bitterest enemies. So he disguised himself as a poor pilgrim returning from the Holy Land. But he was recognized by a costly ring that he wore, and was taken prisoner at Vienna by Duke Leopold. His people in England anxiously awaited his return, and when after a long time he did not appear, they were sadly distressed. There is a legend that a faithful squire named Blondel went in search of him, and as a wandering minstrel travelled for months over Central Europe, vainly seeking for news of his master. At last one day, while singing one of Richard's favorite songs near the walls of the castle where the king was confined, he heard the song repeated from a window. He recognized the voice of Richard. From the window Richard told him to let the English people and the people of Europe know where he was confined, and the minstrel immediately went upon his mission. Soon Europe was astounded to learn that brave Richard of England, the great champion of Christendom, was imprisoned. The story of Blondel is probably not true, but what is true is that England offered to ransom Richard, that the Pope interceded for him, and that finally it was agreed that he should be given up on the payment of a very large sum of money. The English people quickly paid the ransom, and Richard was freed. The King of France had little love for Richard, and Richard's own brother John had less. Both were sorry that Coeur de Lion was at liberty. John had taken charge of the kingdom during his brother's absence, and hoped that Richard might pass the rest of his days in the prison castle of Leopold. As soon as Richard was released, the French king sent word to John, "The devil is loose again." And a very disappointed man was John when all England rang with rejoicing at Richard's return. Upon the death of Richard in 1199, Arthur, the son of his elder brother Geoffrey, was the rightful heir to the throne. John, however, seized the throne himself, and cast Arthur into prison. There is a legend that he ordered Arthur's eyes to be put out with red-hot irons. The jailer, however, was touched by the boy's prayer for mercy, and spared him. But Arthur was not to escape his uncle long. It is said that one night the king took him out upon the Seine in a little boat, murdered him, and cast his body into the river. Besides being a king of England, John was Duke of Normandy, and Philip, king of France, now summoned him to France to answer for the crime of murdering Arthur. John would not answer the summons, and this gave the king of France an excuse for taking possession of Normandy. He did so, and thus this great province was lost for ever to England. Nothing in France was left to John except Aquitaine, which had come to him through his mother. John's government was unjust and tyrannical, and the bishops and barons determined to preserve their rights and the rights of the people. They met on a plain called Runnymede, and then forced John to sign the famous Magna Carta, Great Charter. Magna Carta is the most valuable charter ever granted by any sovereign to his people. In it, King John names all the rights which belong to the citizens under a just government, and he promises that no one of these rights shall ever be taken away from any subjects of an English king. For violating this promise, one English king lost his life, and another lost the American colonies. Magna Carta was signed in 1215. A year after he signed it, the king died. His son Henry III succeeded him. End of the chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Kleperick. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Heron and A. B. Poland. Chapter 24. Louis IX. Louis IX, King from 1226 to 1270. 1. After the time of Barbarossa and King Richard Coeur de Lion lived another great crusading king. This was a grandson of Philip II, named Louis IX, who became sovereign of France in 1226. He was then only 11 years old, so for some years his mother ruled the kingdom. A few years after he began to reign, Louis decided to make his brother Alphonse the governor of a certain part of France. The nobles of the region refused to have Alphonse as governor and invited Henry III of England to help them in a revolt. Henry crossed to France with an army to support the rebellious nobles. He was Duke of Aquitaine and Gascony, so that although he was the King of England, he had to do homage to the King of France for his possessions in that country, and fight for him if called upon to do so. Louis gathered an army and hastened to meet English troops. He drove Henry from place to place, until at last he forced him to make terms of peace. The rebellious nobles who had invited the English king to France soon swore allegiance to Louis, and afterward he had little trouble in his kingdom. Once Louis was dangerously ill, and his life was despaired of. Finally he was believed to be dying, and his wife and chief officials gathered round his bed to await the end. Suddenly he roused himself, and said in a feeble voice, "The cross, the cross." They laid the cross upon his heart, and he clasped it fervently. For a while he slumbered. When he awoke, he appeared much better. In a day or two he was entirely well. He then made a solemn vow that in thankfulness for his restoration he would go on a crusade to the Holy Land. Louis lived at a time when everybody was full of the crusading spirit. A few years before he was born, even the children in France and Germany started out on a crusade of their own. It is called in history the Children's Crusade. Several thousands left their homes and marched toward the Mediterranean. They thought that God would open a pathway to the Holy Land for them through its waters. A number of them died in cold and hunger while trying to cross the Alps. Some reached Rome, and when the Pope saw them, he told them to return home and not think of going on a crusade until they were grown up. It is easy to understand how in such an age people flocked to Louis's banner when he asked for volunteers to go with him on another crusade. In a few months, 40,000 crusaders assembled at a French port on the Mediterranean Sea. On a bright day in August 1248, they went on board the fleet, which was ready to sail. The king called to the crusaders, "Sing in the name of God, shout forth his praises as we sail away." Then quickly on ship after ship, shouts of praise burst from the lips of thousands, and amid the grand chorus the fleet began its voyage. The crusaders went to Damietta in Egypt. Louis was so eager to land that he jumped into the water up to his waist and waded ashore. He captured the city without striking a blow. He had resolved to make war on the Muslims in Egypt rather than the Holy Land, so when he left Damietta he marched southward. He supposed there would be no strong force to stop his progress. However, he was mistaken, for he had not marched 40 miles towards Cairo when he was attacked by a Muslim army led by the Sultan of Egypt. A great battle was fought. The Crusaders were commanded by King Louis, and throughout the battle they showed the utmost bravery, but they were outnumbered. Thousands were slain, and the survivors retreated toward Damietta. The Muslims pursued them, and the Crusaders were obliged to surrender. Out of the 40,000 men who had left France, only about 6,000 now remained. Many had died of disease as well as in battle. King Louis was among the prisoners, and the Sultan of Egypt agreed to release him only upon the payment of a large ransom. When the ransom had been paid, a truce was made for 10 years between Louis and the Sultan, and the good king left Egypt. He then went to the Holy Land, and for 4 years worked to deliver the Crusaders who were in Muslim prisons. 2. During the time that Louis was in the Holy Land, his mother ruled France in Regent. When she died, he returned immediately to his kingdom and devoted himself to governing it. In 1252, he took part in the founding of the Sorbonne, the most famous theological college of Europe from the days of St. Louis down to the time of the French Revolution. He ruled his people so wisely and justly that it is hard to find any better king or even one equally as good in the whole line of French kings. He never wronged any man himself, or knowingly allowed any man to be wronged by others. Near his palace there was a grand oak with wide-spreading branches, under which he used to sit on pleasant days in the summer. There he received all persons who had complaints to make, rich and poor alike. Everyone who came was allowed to tell his story without hindrance. For hours Louis would listen patiently to all the tales of wrongdoing, of hardships and misery that were told him, and would do what he could to right the wrongs of those who suffered. When news came of some more dreadful persecutions of Christians by the Muslims of Palestine, Louis again raised an army of crusaders and started with them for Tunis. Although he was sick and feeble, so sick indeed that he had to be carried on a litter, upon his arrival in Tunis he was attacked by fever and died in a few days. He is better known to the world as Saint Louis than as Louis IX, because some years after his death, Pope Boniface VIII canonized him on account of his pious life and his efforts to rescue the Holy Land from the Turks. End of chapter 24. Recording
Chapter 25 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox, LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Paradise Camouflage. Chapter 25 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Harren and A.B. Poland. Robert Bruce, king from 1306 to 1329. The most famous king that Scotland ever had was Robert Bruce. He lived in the days when Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III were kings of England. During the reign of Edward I, the king of Scotland died, and 13 men claimed the throne. Instead of fighting to decide which of them should be king, they asked Edward to settle the question. When he met the Scottish nobles and the rivals, each of whom thought that next day he would be wearing the crown, Edward told them that he would himself be their king. Just then an English army marched up. What could the nobles do but kneel at the feet of Edward and promise to be his vassals? This they did, and so Scotland became a part of Edward's kingdom, and Baliol, one of the rivals who claimed the Scottish throne, was made the vassal king. Sometime after this, Edward ordered Baliol to raise an army and help him fight the French. Baliol refused to do this, so Edward marched with an army into Scotland and took him prisoner. He was determined that the Scots should have no more kings of their own. So he carried away the sacred stone of Scone on which all kings of Scotland had to sit when they were crowned, and put it in Westminster Abbey in London, and there it is to this day. It is underneath the chair on which the sovereigns of England always sit when the crown of England, Scotland, and Ireland is placed upon their heads. It is said to have been the very stone that Jacob used for a pillow on the night that he saw in his dream angels ascending and descending on the ladder that reached from earth to heaven. Edward now supposed, as he had this sacred stone and had put King Baliol in prison, that Scotland was conquered. But the men whom he appointed to govern the Scots ruled unwisely, and nearly all the people were discontented. Suddenly an army of Scots was raised. It was led by Sir William Wallace, a knight who was almost a giant in size. Wallace's men drove the English out of the country, and Wallace was made the guardian of the realm. Edward then led a great army against him. The Scottish soldiers were nearly all on foot. Wallace arranged them in hollow squares, spearmen on the outside, bowmen within. The English horsemen dashed vainly against the walls of spear points, but King Edward now brought his archers to the front. Thousands of arrows flew from their bows, and thousands of Wallace's men fell dead. The spears were broken, and the Scotch were defeated. Wallace barely escaped with his life. He was afterwards betrayed to Edward, who cruelly put him to death. Part 2. But the Scotch had learned what they could do, and they still went on fighting for freedom, under two leaders named Robert Bruce and John Comyn. Edward marched against them with another large army. He won a great victory, and the nobles once more swore to obey him. But in spite of this oath, Bruce meant to free Scotland if he could, and win the crown. He was privately crowned King of Scotland in the Abbey of Scone in 1306. He said to his wife, "Henceforth you are the Queen and I am the King of our country." "I fear," said his wife, "that we are only playing at being King and Queen, like children in their games." "Nay, I shall be King in earnest," said Bruce. The news that Bruce had been crowned roused all Scotland, and the people took up arms to fight under him against the English. But again King Edward defeated the Scotch, and Bruce himself fled to the Grampian Hills. For 2 months he was closely pursued by the English, who used bloodhounds to track him. He and his followers had many narrow escapes. Once he had to scramble barefoot up some steep rocks, and another time all the party would have been captured had not Bruce awakened just in time to hear the approach of the enemy. He and his men lived by hunting and fishing. However, many brave patriots joined them, and until after a while Bruce had a small army. 5 times he attacked the English, and 5 times he was beaten. After his last defeat, he fled from Scotland and took refuge in a wretched hut on an island off the north coast of Ireland. Here he stayed all alone during one winter. Part 3. It is said that one day, when he was very downhearted, he saw a spider trying to spin a web between two beams of his hut. The little creature tried to throw a thread from one beam to another, but failed. Not discouraged, it tried 4 times more without success. 5 times has the spider failed, said Bruce. That is just the number of times the English have defeated me. If the spider has courage to try again, I also will try to free Scotland. He watched the spider. It rested for a while, as if to gain strength, and then threw its slender thread through the beam. This time it succeeded. I thank God, exclaimed Bruce. The spider has taught me a lesson. No more will I be discouraged. About this time, Edward I died, and his son Edward II succeeded to the throne of England. For about 2 years the new king paid little attention to Scotland. Meantime, Bruce captured nearly all the Scotch castles that were held by the English, and the nobles and chiefs throughout the country acknowledged him as their king. At last Edward II marched into Scotland at the head of 100,000 men. Bruce met him at Bannockburn on June the 24th, 1314, with 30,000 soldiers. Before the battle began, Bruce rode along the front of his army to encourage his men. Suddenly an English knight, Henry de Bohun, galloped across the field and tried to strike him down with a spear. Bruce saw his danger in time, and with a quick stroke of his battle-axe he cleft the knight's skull. The Scotch army shouted again and again at this feat of their commander, and they went into the battle feeling sure that the victory would be theirs. They rushed upon the English with fury, and although outnumbered 3-1, completely defeated them. Thousands of the English were slain, and a great number captured. In spite of this terrible blow, Edward never gave up his claim to the Scottish crown. But his son Edward III, in 1328, recognised Scotland's independence and acknowledged Bruce as her king. End of chapter 25. Recording by Andy from Inverarnon, melys.ws.
Chapter 26 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Harn and A. B. Poland. Chapter 26 Marco Polo. Marco Polo lived from 1254 to 1324. Some years before St. Louis led his last crusade, there was born in Venice a boy named Marco Polo. His father was a wealthy merchant who often went on trading journeys to distant lands. In 1271, when Marco was 17 years old, he accompanied his father and uncle on a journey through the Holy Land, Persia, and Tartary, and at length to the Empire of China, then called Kathi. It took the travelers 3 years to reach Kathi. The Emperor of Kathi was a monarch named Kublai Khan, who lived in Peking. Marco's father and uncle had been in Kathi once before, and had entertained Kublai Khan by telling him about the manners and customs of Europe. So when the 2 Venetian merchants again appeared in Peking, Kublai Khan was glad to see them. He was also greatly pleased with the young Marco, whom he invited to the palace. Important positions at the Chinese court were given to Marco's father and uncle, and so they and Marco lived in the country for some years. Marco studied the Chinese language, and it was not very long before he could speak it. When he was about 21, Kublai Khan sent him on a very important business to a distant part of China. He did the work well, and from that time was often employed as an envoy of the Chinese monarch. His travels were sometimes in lands never before visited by Europeans, and he had many strange adventures among the almost unknown tribes of Asia. Step by step he was promoted. For several years he was governor of a great Chinese city. Finally he and his father and uncle desired to return to Venice. They had all served Kublai Khan faithfully, and he had appreciated it and given them rich rewards, but he did not wish to let them go. While the matter was being talked over, an embassy arrived in Peking from the King of Persia. This monarch desired to marry the daughter of Kublai Khan, the Princess Kokahin, and he had sent to ask her father for her hand. Consent was given, and Kublai Khan fitted out a fleet of 14 ships to carry the wedding party to Persia. The Princess Kokahin was a great friend of Marco Polo, and urged her father to allow him to go with the party. Finally Kublai Khan gave his consent. Marco's father and uncle were also allowed to go, and the 3 Venetians left China. The fleet with the wedding party on board sailed southward on the China Sea. It was a long and perilous voyage. Stops were made at Borneo, Sumatra, Ceylon, and other places, until the ships entered the Persian Gulf and the princess was safely landed. After they reached the capital of Persia, the party, including the 3 Venetians, was entertained by the Persians for weeks in a magnificent manner, and costly presents were given to all. At last the Venetians left their friends, went to the Black Sea, and took ship for Venice. They had been away so long, and were so much changed in appearance, that none of their relations and old friends knew them when they arrived in Venice. As they were dressed in Tatar costume, and sometimes spoke the Chinese language to one another, they found it hard to convince people that they were members of the Polo family. At length, in order to show that they were the men that they declared themselves to be, they gave a dinner to all their relations and old friends. When the guests arrived, they were greeted by the travelers, arrayed in gorgeous Chinese robes of crimson satin. After the first course they appeared in crimson damask; after the second they changed their costumes to crimson velvet; while at the end of the dinner they appeared in usual garb of wealthy Venetians. "Now, my friends," said Marco, "I will show you something that will please you." He then brought into the room the rough Tatar coats which he and his father and uncle had worn when they reached Venice. Cutting open the seams, he took from inside the lining packets filled with rubies, emeralds, and diamonds. It was the finest collection of jewels ever seen in Venice. The guests were now persuaded that their hosts were indeed what they claimed to be. 800 years before Marco Polo's birth, some of the people of North Italy had fled before Attila to the muddy islands of the Adriatic and founded Venice upon them. Since then the little settlement had become the most wealthy and powerful city of Europe. Venice was the queen of the Adriatic, and her merchants were princes. They had vessels to bring the costly wares of the East to their wharves. They had warships to protect their rich cargoes from the pirates of the Mediterranean. They carried on wars. At the time when Marco Polo returned from Catti, they were at war with Genoa. The 2 cities were fighting for the trade of the world. In a great naval battle the Venetians were completely defeated. Marco Polo was in the battle, and with many of his countrymen was captured by the enemy. For a year he was confined in a Genoese prison. One of his fellow prisoners was a skillful penman, and Marco dictated to him an account of his experiences in China, Japan, and other Eastern countries. This account was carefully written out. Copies of the manuscript exist to this day. One of these is in a library in Paris. It was carried into France in the year 1307. Another copy is preserved in the city of Bern. It is said that the book was translated into many languages, so that people in all parts of Europe learned about Marco's adventures. About 175 years after the book was written, the famous Genoese, Christopher Columbus, planned his voyage across the Atlantic. It is believed that he had read Marco's description of Java, Sumatra, and other East India Islands, which he thought he had reached when he discovered Haiti and Cuba. So Marco Polo may have suggested to Columbus the voyage which led to the discovery of America. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Famous Men of the Middle Ages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. Famous Men of the Middle Ages by John H. Hearn and A. B. Poland. Chapter 27 Edward the Black Prince. Edward the Black Prince lived from 1330 till 1376. One of the most famous warriors of the Middle Ages was Edward the Black Prince. He was so called because he wore black armor in battle. The Black Prince was the son of Edward III, who reigned over England from 1327 to 1377. He won his fame as a soldier in the wars which his father carried on against France. You remember that the early kings of England, from the time of William the Conqueror, had possessions in France. Henry II, William's grandson, was the Duke of Normandy and Lord of Brittany and other provinces, and when he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, she brought him that province also. Henry's son John lost all the French possessions of the English crown except a part of Aquitaine, and Edward III inherited this. So when Philip of Valois became King of France, about a year after Edward had become King of England, Edward had to do homage to Philip. To be King of England and yet to do homage to the King of France, to bend the knee before Philip and kiss his foot, was something Edward did not like. He thought it was quite beneath his dignity, as his ancestor Rollo had thought when told that he must kiss the foot of King Charles. So Edward tried to persuade the nobles of France that he himself ought by right to be the King of France instead of being only a vassal. Philip of Valois was only a cousin of the late French King Charles IV. Edward was the son of his sister. But there was a curious old law in France called the Salic law, which forbade that daughter should inherit lands. This law barred the claim of Edward, because his claim came through his mother. Still he determined to win the French throne by force of arms. A chance came to quarrel with Philip. Another of Philip's vassals rebelled against him, and Edward helped the rebel. He hoped by doing so to weaken Philip and more easily overpower him. Philip at once declared that Edward's possessions in France were forfeited. Then Edward raised an army of 30,000 men and with it invaded France. The Black Prince was now only about 16 years of age, but he had already shown himself brave in battle, and his father put him in command of one of the divisions of the army. Thousands of French troops led by King Philip were hurried from Paris to meet the advance of the English, and on the 26th of August, 1346, the two armies fought a hard battle at the village of Crécy. During the battle the division of the English army commanded by the Black Prince had to bear the attack of the whole French force. The prince fought so bravely and managed his men so well that King Edward, who was overlooking the field of battle from a windmill on the top of a hill, sent him words of praise for his gallant work. Again and again the prince's men drew back the French in splendid style, but at last they seemed about to give way before a very fierce charge, and the Earl of Warwick hastened to Edward to advise him to send the prince aid. "Is my son dead, or unhorsed, or so wounded that he cannot help himself?" asked the king. "No, sire," was the reply, "but he is hard pressed." "Return to your post, and come not to me again for aid so long as my son lives," said the king. "Let the boy prove himself a true knight and win his spurs." The Earl went to the Prince and told him what his father had said. "I will prove myself a true knight," exclaimed the Prince. "My father is right, I need no aid. My men will hold their post as long as they have strength to stand." Then he rode where the battle was still furiously raging, and encouraged his men. The King of France led his force a number of times against the Prince's line, but could not break it, and was at last compelled to retire. The battle now went steadily against the French, although they far outnumbered the English. Finally, 40,000 of Philip's soldiers lay dead upon the field, and nearly all the remainder of his army was captured. Philip gave up the struggle and fled. Among those who fought on the side of French at Crécy was the blind King of Bohemia, who always wore 3 white feathers in his helmet. When the battle was at its height, the blind king had his followers lead him into the thick of the fight, and he dealt heavy blows upon his unseen foes until he fell mortally wounded. The 3 white feathers were taken from his helmet by the Black Prince, who ever after wore them himself. As soon as he could, King Edward rode over the field to meet his son. "Prince," he said as he greeted him, "you are the conqueror of the French." Turning to the soldiers who had gathered around him, the king shouted: "Cheer! Cheer for the Black Prince! Cheer for the hero of Crécy!" What cheering then rose on the battlefield! The air rang with the name of the Black Prince. Soon after the battle of Crécy, King Edward laid siege to Calais. But the city resisted his attack for 12 months. During the siege the Black Prince aided his father greatly. After the capture of Calais, it was agreed to stop fighting for 7 years, and Edward's army embarked for England. In 1355, Edward again declared war against the French. The Black Prince invaded France with an army of 60,000 men. He captured rich towns and gathered a great deal of booty. While he was preparing to move on Paris, the King of France raised a great army and marched against him. The Black Prince had lost so many men by sickness that he had only about 10,000 when he reached the city of Poitiers. Suddenly, near the city, he was met by the French force of about 55,000, splendidly armed and commanded by the king himself. "God help us!" exclaimed the prince, when he looked at the long lines of the French as they marched on a plain before him. Early on the morning of September 14th, 1356, the battle began. The English were few in number, but they were determined to contest every inch of the ground, and not surrender while 100 of them remained to fight. For hours they withstood the onset of the French. At last a body of English horsemen charged furiously on one part of the French line, while the Black Prince attacked another part. This sudden movement caused confusion among the French. Many of them fled from the field. When the Black Prince saw this, he shouted to his men, "Advance, English banners, in the name of God and St. George!" His army rushed forward, and the French were defeated. Thousands of prisoners were taken, including the King of France and many of his nobles. The king was sent to England, where he was treated with the greatest kindness. When some time afterwards there was a splendid procession in London to celebrate the victory of Poitiers, he was allowed to ride in the procession on a beautiful white horse, while the Black Prince rode on a pony at his side. The Black Prince died in 1376. He was sincerely mourned by the English people. They felt that they had lost a prince who would have made a great and good king. End of the chapter 27.